October 1986. A small, overgrown cemetery on the outskirts of Bishop, California, in the Owens Valley below the Sierra Nevada. A groundskeeper named Walt Furney is mowing between rows of headstones that mostly belong to ranchers and railroad men from the 1920s. He stops his mower beside a flat patch of grass with no marker at all, just a slightly raised mound and a numbered metal stake driven into the dirt decades ago by a county worker who has long since retired or died himself. Walt has mowed around this particular stake for 11 years without ever knowing who is under it. On this October afternoon, a car pulls off the county road and parks at the cemetery gate. A tall, lean man gets out, wearing sunglasses and a canvas jacket, holding a folded piece of paper with an address written on it that turns out, when he asks Walt, to correspond to plot number 114, row C, the unmarked mound the mower has just gone around. The man is 56 years old. He has been looking for this grave for 11 months. His name is Clint Eastwood. What he does over the next 3 years, after finding it, is going to put a name back on a stone that should have had one for 30 years. Here is the story. Arthur Lubin was not a famous name by 1986, and he had not been a famous name even at the height of his career, which was the particular and common fate of directors who worked steadily, competently, and without controversy through the studio system of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, making pictures that audiences enjoyed and critics mostly ignored, building careers that were respected within the industry and invisible outside it. Lubin had directed Abbott and Costello comedies. He had directed 3 Francis the Talking Mule pictures, a series that made the studio considerable money and earned Lubin, fairly or not, a reputation as a competent journeyman rather than an artist, the kind of director whose name appears in a credit crawl and means nothing to the audience watching the picture they came to see. He was not bitter about this. He had a long, full career and considered himself fortunate to have worked steadily in an industry that discarded people far more talented than himself for reasons having nothing to do with talent. In 1958, Lubin was hired by CBS to direct the pilot episode and several subsequent episodes of a new television western called Rawhide. The series needed a young actor for a secondary role, a ramrod, the second in command on a cattle drive. A part with less screen time than the lead, but with real potential if the actor could hold a scene. Lubin auditioned dozens of young men for the part. He settled on a 28-year-old contract player named Clint Eastwood, who had appeared in small roles in a number of pictures without ever breaking through, who was, by his own later admission, on the edge of giving up the business entirely and going back to construction work if Rawhide had not come through. Lubin directed Eastwood in 11 episodes across the show's first 2 seasons. What he gave the young actor in those 11 episodes was not, by Eastwood's own later account, primarily technical instruction, though there was some of that. It was something closer to permission. Lubin had noticed, in the earliest episodes, that Eastwood's natural instinct was toward stillness, toward underplaying a scene rather than pushing it, an instinct that ran directly counter to the prevailing style of television westerns in 1958, which favored broad, theatrical gestures that read clearly on small black-and-white screens. Most directors working in that format would have corrected the instinct out of him, told him to project more, to make sure the emotion was legible to a viewer half watching from across a living room while doing something else. Lubin did the opposite. He pulled the camera in closer. He told Eastwood, on the set of the 3rd episode they worked on together, that the audience would lean toward a face that was not performing at them, that stillness on camera was not absence, it was invitation. and that the cheapest trick in the business was mistaking volume for depth. He told him to trust the close-up. He told him the camera would do work that his face did not need to do twice. Eastwood carried this instruction for the rest of his career. He has said so publicly many times in interviews stretching across 5 decades, crediting Lubin by name as one of the handful of people who taught him something about acting and directing that he never had to relearn or unlearn later. He has said it in documentaries about his own career. He has said it in interviews promoting his own pictures as a director, drawing a direct line from Lubin's instruction on a television soundstage in 1958 through to the patient, watchful style Sergio Leone would reinforce and elaborate on 6 years later in Almeria, and through to Eastwood's own directorial style across the decades that followed. Arthur Lubin, in the public record of Eastwood's own words, is credited consistently and sincerely as a foundational influence. What was missing for nearly 30 years was any indication that Eastwood had ever gone looking for the man himself. Lubin retired from active directing in the early 1970s. He had no children. His wife, Vera, predeceased him by 6 years, dying in 1973. He lived alone in a modest house in Pasadena through the remainder of the decade, increasingly forgotten by an industry that, as industries do, moves forward without pausing to check on the people who built its earlier floors. He died in 1995 at the age of 93, which means that the cemetery in Bishop that Eastwood visited in 1986 did not yet contain Arthur Lubin himself. It contained someone else entirely, a fact that becomes important to understand the actual shape of this story, because the unmarked grave Eastwood was searching for in 1986 belonged not to Lubin, but to a man almost no one in Hollywood remembered at all. Lubin's longtime camera operator and closest friend on the Rawhide set, a man named Russell Voss. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Russell Voss had operated camera for Arthur Lubin across 4 different productions spanning nearly 2 decades, including all 11 of the Rawhide episodes Lubin directed. Voss was, by every account from people who worked alongside him, the kind of technician whose contribution to a finished piece of film is invisible to anyone who does not understand cameras, and essential to anyone who does. He was the man who actually executed the close, patient framing that Lubin called for, the man who understood exactly how far to push in on a young actor's face to capture the stillness Lubin wanted without making the audience feel crowded or staged. Eastwood had worked directly with Voss for those 11 episodes in a way that, on a television set in 1958, often meant more sustained creative collaboration with the operator than with the director, who was frequently managing multiple administrative concerns at once. Voss had told Eastwood, on more than one occasion during long setup waits between shots, that he had grown up in the Owens Valley, in the high desert town of Bishop, the son of a ranch hand, and that he intended to retire there someday, away from the city, back where the air was clear and the mountains were close. Voss did retire to Bishop in 1971, after a camera operating career that had quietly spanned over 200 film and television productions, without his name ever once appearing above the title of anything. He lived alone in a small house outside town. He had been briefly married in his 30s. The marriage had ended without children. He had, by the time he retired, lost touch with nearly everyone from his working years, the natural attrition of a long career built around people who moved on to other sets, other cities, other lives, the way film crews scatter the moment a production wraps and rarely reassemble in the same configuration twice. He died alone in his Bishop house in the spring of 1975, found 3 days later by a neighbor who noticed his mail had not been collected. He had no immediate family to claim the body or arrange the burial. The county handled it the way counties handle the unclaimed dead, with a basic plot, a basic service, attended by almost no one, and a numbered metal stake instead of a headstone, because headstones cost money that no one was positioned to spend on a man whose entire working life had been devoted to making other people look good on camera, while he remained, by professional necessity and personal temperament, invisible. Eastwood learned of Voss's death only in 1985, 10 years after it happened, in an offhand conversation with another retired cameraman at an industry memorial event for an unrelated director. The cameraman mentioned, almost as a piece of trivia, that Russ Voss, who had shot some of the early Rawhide episodes, had died years earlier out in Bishop, and that nobody from the old crew had even known until long after the funeral. Eastwood asked a few questions. He learned that Voss had been buried without a marker. He learned the name of the cemetery. He did not learn the exact plot location, because the cameraman did not know it either, and because, as Eastwood discovered over the following months, the county records from 1975 were not digitized, not centralized, and not particularly easy to locate at all for a man with no surviving family to request them. It took Eastwood 11 months of intermittent effort, conducted largely through his production office's administrative staff rather than personally, to track down the plot number through a combination of county clerk records, an old funeral home ledger that had survived a change of ownership, and finally a phone call to Walt Furney, the cemetery's longtime groundskeeper, who remembered, when finally asked directly, that there was an unmarked plot near the cemetery's eastern fence line that an old funeral director had once told him belonged to, in Walt's words, some fellow from the picture business who didn't have anybody. Eastwood drove out to Bishop himself in October of 1986, rather than sending anyone on his behalf. A 6-hour drive from his home in Carmel, across the spine of California that he made alone, without an assistant, without announcing the trip to anyone beyond a brief note to his office about being unreachable for 2 days. He stood at the unmarked mound in plot 114, row C, for a long time, according to Walt Furney's later account, the only witness to the visit. He did not say much. He asked Walt to confirm twice that this was definitely the location, that there was no possibility of confusion with an adjacent plot. Walt confirmed it both times, based on the funeral director's old ledger notation that he had cross-referenced himself before Eastwood's arrival. Eastwood stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the unmarked grass for what Walt estimated was nearly 20 minutes. Then he asked Walt a single question. What would it take to give this man a proper stone? Walt told him it was not complicated. Just paperwork with the county to formally register a memorial marker for an unmarked plot, which required, in cases without surviving family, a documented next-of-kin search demonstrating no living relatives existed to object or claim responsibility themselves. A search that could take a county clerk's office considerable time, given how backed up rural county offices in the eastern Sierra tended to be, particularly for a death that had occurred over a decade earlier with thin original documentation. Eastwood thanked him. He did not leave a check that day, which surprised Walt, who had assumed, reasonably, that a famous and wealthy man visiting an unmarked grave would simply pay whatever it cost and move on within the hour. Instead, Eastwood asked Walt for the name and address of the county clerk's office, said he would be in touch, and drove back to Carmel that same evening. Have you ever tried to fix something that the system itself was not designed to let you fix quickly? Some debts cannot simply be paid. They have to be earned through patience. The unglamorous kind. The kind that takes years and produces no dramatic moment, only paperwork. Until suddenly, one day, it does. What followed was not a dramatic act of generosity completed in an afternoon. It was 3 years of bureaucratic patience, conducted almost entirely through Eastwood's production office attorney, a man accustomed to far more complicated legal matters than a rural county's next of kin search, but who took on this particular task personally at Eastwood's specific request, rather than delegating it to a junior associate. The attorney filed the formal petition with Inyo County in early 1987. The county's response, typical of a small rural office with limited staff handling a low-priority historical matter, took the better part of a year simply to confirm that Russell Voss had, in fact, died with no documented surviving relatives, a confirmation that required cross-referencing records across multiple counties, and, eventually, a newspaper notice run in 3 California papers inviting any relatives to come forward, a notice that produced no response, which was itself the final piece of evidence the county required to formally clear the way for a memorial to be placed without a competing claim. Once the county cleared the petition in late 1988, the actual work of designing and placing the headstone took several more months, conducted with a care that surprised the stonemason and bishop who received the commission. Eastwood did not simply order a standard marker with a name and dates. He requested specific language be carved into the stone, language he wrote himself and revised twice through correspondence with the mason before approving a final version. The headstone, finally placed in the spring of 1989, nearly 3 years after Eastwood's first visit to the unmarked mound, reads, Russell Voss, 1919 to 1975, camera operator. He taught a young actor that the camera sees what the heart does not say. The final line was not biographical information in any conventional sense. It was, as Walt Furney understood it when he finally read the finished stone, a direct paraphrase of something Eastwood had told him on that October afternoon in 1986 that Voss himself had once said to a nervous young actor between takes on a 1958 television set, a piece of guidance that had traveled unattributed through Eastwood's entire career, embedded in interviews where Eastwood credited Arthur Lubin for the broader philosophy, but had never once, until this headstone, publicly credited the camera operator who had actually executed it, shot after shot, for 11 episodes, and had then spent the next 17 years of his life unremembered by an industry he had quietly helped shape. Eastwood attended the small dedication at the graveside in May of 1989, accompanied only by Walt Furney and the stonemason. There was no press present, no announcement made beforehand or afterward, no mention of the event in any trade publication or interview Eastwood gave in the years that followed. He stood at the finished stone for a few minutes. He did not give a speech, because there was no one present who required one. Walt Furney has said, in the one interview he gave about the day, decades later, to a small regional historical society compiling oral histories of the Owens Valley, that Eastwood simply read the inscription once, silently, nodded once, and said, more to himself than to anyone else, "That's better," before thanking Walt for his help over the 3 years and driving back toward Carmel. The cemetery in Bishop still maintains the plot. Walt Furney's son, who took over the groundskeeping duties when Walt retired in 2002, mows around the stone the same way his father once mowed around the bare metal stake. Except now there is something to mow around that means something to anyone who stops to read it, which is not many people, because Russell Voss remains, today, essentially unknown outside the small circle of film historians who occasionally stumble across his name in old production credits and wonder, briefly, who he was. The Historical Society's Oral History Project, conducted in 2011, is the only public record connecting the stone to Eastwood at all, and it has been read, by the Society's own estimate, by perhaps a few hundred people in the years since it was recorded, a number that would not register as a rounding error against the audience for any single picture Eastwood ever starred in. Eastwood has continued, across the decades since 1989, to credit Arthur Lubin publicly for the foundational lesson about stillness and the close-up, the lesson that shaped his entire career as both an actor and a director. He has never publicly mentioned Russell Voss in any interview, any documentary, any public account of his own development before or after 1989. The correction he made was not a correction of the public record. The public record still credits the director, which is, in the conventional accounting of how film credit works, not inaccurate, since Lubin was indeed the one who articulated the philosophy. What Eastwood corrected was something smaller and, in its own way, larger. The fact that the man who had actually put that philosophy into practice, shot after shot, for 11 episodes, on a low-budget television set in 1958, and who had then died alone 17 years later with no one left to remember him, would no longer lie under an unmarked mound that a groundskeeper mowed around without knowing a name. There is a particular kind of debt that the world does not require anyone to pay. Because the world has already forgotten there is a debt at all. Arthur Lubin received his due across decades of interviews and credited influence, a debt the public record settled on its own, simply by Eastwood telling the truth whenever he was asked. Russell Voss received nothing, not because what he gave mattered less, but because no one ever thought to ask about the man standing behind the camera rather than the one calling action. It took a stray sentence at an unrelated memorial service, 11 months of searching, 3 years of bureaucratic patience, and a stonemason willing to carve language that meant nothing to him but everything to the man who wrote it, to make sure that debt got paid too, quietly, to an audience of one groundskeeper and a finished piece of granite. That is the whole of it. That is what 3 years actually bought. And unfortunately, they do not make men like that anymore. If this story reached you, pass it on. Share it with someone who has spent a career standing just out of frame, doing the work that makes other people look good. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.